after e4, b6, d4, and bishop goes to fianchetto in b7, and bishop to d3. So in the previous 3 videos, I was focusing on g6 and h5, and basically the 2 fianchettos. In this one, I'm going to go through e6, which is the main move here. And basically the bishop doesn't immediately go to a fianchetto, the dark red bishop could go to a fianchetto later on. White plays knight f3 now. Eventually we want to play a move like e5, because it goes with the familiar pattern of the pawn d4 and e5, and then the knight c3 for example, or d2, and then e4, going for those weaknesses of the dark squares. But e5 was not possible already because the bishop would have trapped the rook from g2. So knight f3 has to come. And now let's look at this move. This is very popular even though it's bad, and you have to know exactly how to continue. So e5 is the move now. And of course bishop takes knight is an insanity, queen takes back, and then the knight can't really go to d5 for example to block the queen from attacking the rook, because you can attack the knight will be pinned, we can attack it with a weaker pawn basically. And so the knight has to move. After knight d5 you go on with c4, kicking the knight away, and after knight to b4 you just remove the bishop to avoid the trade, and the situation is compromised for black. So let's just look at 2 moves. One of them is an example of bishop e7, just a normal developing move to castle eventually. The other one is the best move, which is a5. So after bishop e7, white continues with a3. So that's the pattern to remember. 2 ideas now, the knight either to a6 or c6. There's no other squares where the knight can go to. Let's look at knight c6 first, because it's the worst one, and then we'll look at knight a6. Now white continues with d5, and the knight's got nowhere to go. Well, knight a5 gets trapped by b4, right? So after pawn takes and pawn takes, same problem. Knight is forced to a5, and then b4 wins a piece. In this position, knight a6 is better. White continues with b4 anyway, and white's got a huge advantage on the queen side, like much more space. And black's pieces can't move. The knight can't move anywhere. The knight can't really go to c6 because the space that white has and controlled by the pawns will allow white to go for an attack already with the pawns. So let's look at this scenario, c6, which looks silly because the knight can't move, but like that's an idea, it's a possibility because it puts more protection over the queen side. White goes on with knight c3. Potentially we are able to go to a place like e4, and after castling, white continues with a thematic h4. This is a pattern to remember. So when the bishops are like this, aligned towards the opponent king side, play h4, which allows knight g5. It allows black bishop can never really take you because that opens the file for the rook. It's just too strong for white. So let's look at this as well. d6 is a move that one can play in this position. Of course, pushing a pawn on the king side doesn't give white anything, because it doesn't give black anything, because white can always play a move like bishop d3 attacking h7. The black king will never be able to go to h7, allowing something like rook g8. So it's pointless. Let's look at pawn to d6, challenge in the center. How do we deal with this? White. So let's look at 3 options here very quickly. A move like pawn takes is completely wrong, loses immediately because of bishop takes with check. Either the king takes or doesn't take. We're going to play knight g5 check, and there's a checkmate coming soon, so there's no reason to continue this game. So in this position, pawn takes pawn is not possible. Let's look at h6 in case somebody was wondering. h6 is to stop knight g5. This is met by this thematic move, rook h3. We will have an attack for the bishop towards h6. The rook can go to g3 eventually, and after the knight moves, the queen will join the game. The black player can't move any of these pieces over here, so it's just game over. How do we meet a move like f5, which is very typical in these kind of positions? We have to take en passant, of course, and that will be it. It doesn't stop anything. White's advantage is huge. If rook takes, for instance, developing the rook, allowing the queen to come and help, maybe the rook is protecting h6 a little bit further. Either way, white continues with knight e4, attacking the rook, and after rook f7, it's not very important where the rook goes. I mean, yeah, it could have gone to f8, but like, the moves are going to be fairly similar. You're just building the position. The advantage is something like +8 or something like that, as far as I remember. Now, for example, let's remember this thematic move. knight to g5 like this, you can give up the knight because that will allow the queen to come in. The knight's attacking the rook, and the rook moves, the knight's still attacking f6, the knight will attack e6 as well. So after, let's say, pawn takes, now queen h5 comes, and nothing stops white from going to g5 with the knight, threatening the rook, threatening h7, and so on. There's also bishop. Let's close this line quickly by showing this move, just to make an example, g4 attacking the rook. This is just to illustrate the fact that we really don't need that rook, because our development is amazing. White goes on with knight g5, ignores the rook. We're threatening this. There's also this move, depending on what black does. So taking the rook is a suicide, but also taking the knight if that happens, because check, king moves, check, king moves, and then check, and there's a mate to come soon. So in this position, once again, we looked at h6. Let's see g6. White continues with queen d2. The idea of infiltrating with the queen, exploiting the fact that we have a pawn in h4 to support the knight, so that we don't worry about the knight getting taken and the rook coming in an open file. So black cannot play a move like h5, for example, to try and get the king some more space, because queen h6. And it's all compromised already. If black takes the pawn, again, we ignore it, queen h6, and we should be able to win soon. If somebody's thinking about a move like f6, stopping the knight, then this doesn't work either because of the bishop. So this is not going to go anywhere. Nothing stops the checkmate in two moves, which is knight g5 going for h7. And the knight cannot be taken because of this cover check. So let's go back from the start. The bishop goes in fianchetto, and then bishop d3, e6, knight f3, and now black is playing the early knight f6. We punish it with e5, knight moves, c4, knight b4. We just have to retreat the bishop. Black hasn't won any tempo or anything. Yeah, we are retreating the bishop, but this knight is very silly. According to the engine, it's a5, but again, we just attack the knight. And after knight to a6, the good thing about this a5 move is that it gives more control over square b4 for black, and so we don't have that possibility to trap the knight if black plays well, but we should be winning because of the position. Bishop e3 is the next move. So let's look at two scenarios. One of them is desperate attempt of finally getting some proper development, which is knight c6, maybe idea queen e7 and black can try to castle long side, or maybe bishop e7 and castle short side, although white's pieces are craving to start an attack on the king side. Knight c6, white continues with knight c3. The game is not getting any normal. Just because it looks like both players are managing to develop pieces, it's not going to go to a normal endgame because the black is compromised. After bishop e7, for instance, now that we have a knight in c3, it would have happened anyway, even if black had played another move. We can play d5. And that knight isn't going anywhere. It will have to go back to b8. Either way, we can leave things like this. We can also have an idea of d6 in case you want to play d6. It's not entirely wrong afterwards. But let's see now, pawn takes, and then the knight goes back, has to go to b8. White now continues with queen to c2. It's an amazing move because white knows that black will have to castle kingside or no castle at all. In case black doesn't castle, we're always going to have pressure on this square. And in case black tries to castle long sides, it will be incredible, very long, because after d6, knight d7, you know, you can't really, you're going to have to play c6, and then the queen has to move. It's just impossible for black to castle a long side. So after castling, for example, white plays the thematic h4. And it's very similar to the previous situation. g5 might come anytime. Let's have a look at this move, which I've encountered personally. Bishop c5. This is where personally I failed to find the best move. I should have just continued with the usual plan, which is knight g5, going for h7. But in my defense, it was a blitz game. So after knight g5, black has to stop the checkmate threat, right? So g6, and now the knight goes to e4. And that's how the game should be played. Attacking the bishop, threatening to win the pawn, and go to a completely winning position. If this bishop is gone, then the dark squares around the king will suffer even more. And let's look at this scenario just so we understand how to deal with these two amazing knights. Bishop takes e3. We don't take back, we just play knight f6 check. And after the king moves, how do we capitalize this? We take the bishop back first of all, and we're willing to push the pawn. Black's best move according to the engine is queen e7, but still h5. The idea is to open everything, so that the rook can do a checkmate. And rook h8 doesn't work because of h6 check. Only move is king to f8 and then queen to c3, with the idea of playing knight h7 check, and there's going to be a checkmate to follow. So let's just see it very quickly. Queen c3, it's just unstoppable. Knight h7 is unstoppable. Your king can't move. So whatever black does, white is threatening check. And then after take, for example, white will have this passed pawn. If the king goes back, then e6 will allow the infiltration of the queen. This is an excellent diagonal. I just finished this position. We mentioned that rook h8 doesn't work. So after h5, rook h8 is not possible. A move like h6, for example, just so we illustrate how to finish such type of scenario. Here, you just feel free to give up the knight, because if he takes, the rook can go to h7, and if pawn takes back, then knight h5 should end the game. The knight's attacking each one of these squares, and the queen is willing to go to g6 soon, and the pawn can't take because the queen will have access to the diagonal. So one more scenario would be this one. e6, knight f3, knight f6. Here's how we punish it. e5, knight moves, c4, knight moves. Save the bishop from the threat of exchange. After the best move by black, which is a5, we attack the knight. The knight goes back, and now bishop e3. This scenario we haven't seen, which is c5. It's a thematic move here in such positions, going for the pawn in d4, gaining some freedom. The queen might be able to move, and black is challenging the great control of the center that white's got. Here we don't waste time. We don't allow any of that. We play d5. And after take, well, you might be wondering, it doesn't have to take, right? But the point is, if they don't take, they can never move anything. You just leave it there. It's stopping the knight from developing, and puts pressure on the pawn in e6, which is a very, very fragile pawn, because when the pawn moves to d6, for instance, there would be options of taking. It depends on how you want to play. So let's go through this take. In this scenario, we're looking at what black player can try to do to alleviate the pain. This is already a much better situation for white, because black can't move a thing. Let's look at this scenario. When they play d6, for example, this loses immediately because of bishop b5 check. The only way to block would be with a knight. Of course, the king can't move because the game won't last long. There's a checkmate to follow soon enough. After knight blocks, for instance, then e6 finishes the game.